Welcome, everyone. I'm Rohini Pandey. I'm the director of the Economic Growth Center. I returned to Yale last year in 2019. I'm also a professor of the economics department. So as many of you know, this weekend is a culmination of a year-long celebration of 50 years of women undergraduates at Yale and 150 years of graduate students. But as a center, it's also a good time for us to recognize the contributions of women as faculty mentors and researchers who supported university activities in many ways. The Economic Growth Center, which was founded in 1961, was perhaps at that time the first US university center that was focused on looking at developing country issues. Also, as we'll talk about, it happened to be in its starting years, a place where a number of extremely illustrious women made home for different points in time. I'm soon going to hand it to Lisa Qian, who will talk about some of them. But let me just mention some additional individuals who were extremely important at the start of the center. First, of course, as graduate students, development economics has been a field that has attracted, I think I'd say, individuals who try to look outside the mainstream. And perhaps a classic example of that, and one that's been featured in other writing that Lisa has done, was Cynthia Morris Taft, who went on, along with Irma Adleman, to write some of the most important early work on the role of institutions in economics. EGC was also the home for Yale's first female faculty member, Marsha Goldfarb, who joined the Economic Growth Center and then went on the next year to be the first economics faculty member who's a woman. And then finally, we also happen to have been home to Susan Eggers, who as an administrative staff member at Yale and at the Economic Growth Center, came upon Fortran as a computing program to look at data in development economics, and used that as a launching part for an extremely impressive career in computer science. So what I hope today we can do is celebrate these and many other women who have been incredibly important for Yale, both in economics and also for the Economic Growth Center, and recognize that very often, as we look at centers and their current history, we perhaps don't pay as much attention as we should to those who played an important role in getting it where it did, and I very much hope we're able to do that today. So with that, let me hand it over to Lisa Qian. As way of introduction, Lisa Qian graduated from Yale with a bachelor's in economics and a specialization in human rights in 2020. We were lucky to attract her as an intern at the Economic Growth Center till January. And when it started, it was just a very casual conversation where we were like, oh, maybe we should find out something about the history of Economic Growth Center and the role of women. And Lisa went on to do an absolutely amazing job of telling us about exactly how Economic Growth Center and Yale Economics benefited from women. So I'm going to hand it over to Lisa, who's going to go take us through a short presentation on this. Lisa, over to you.
Thanks, Rohini. And like Rohini said, I spent the past, I would say, maybe 8 months looking into the history of the Growth Center and specifically into the women's contributions that were often overlooked. And so today, I'm super honored to be sitting with 4 women who come from different pockets of the Yale community. But before we get into that, I wanted to first say that this session is being recorded, just so that everyone knows. And in addition, if you feel like you have any questions at any time, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I wanted to first start out by maybe telling a story of how we kind of got into this research. And so for us, that begins with the founding of the Economic Growth Center. And so that was in 1961, as Rohini said. And Lloyd Reynolds, the former economics department chair, received funding from the Ford Foundation to start the EGC. And its focus would be development economics. And it was one of the first development economics research centers, even in the world at the time. So as part of the founding, there were 3 women who were part of the founding team, all in research and administrative support positions. All 3 had PhDs, and all 3 also happened to be married to Yale economics professors. And they were Mary Reynolds, Miriam Chamberlain, and Nancy Ruggles. But 6 years later, they were all fired amid a new flash of concern for nepotism in the department. So because they were married to Yale economics professors, some people viewed it as immoral that they were also hired in the same department, which obviously we know just does not happen at all today, but that was the view at the time. And so when Rohini was going through some of the documents that cover the EGC's history, she came across the story and was intrigued and asked me to dig into each one of the women. And so the first person I studied was Nancy Ruggles. Nancy attended Brown University for her undergraduate education and then Harvard for a PhD in economics. However, at the time, Harvard would not award degrees to women, so she received a Radcliffe degree. And Pat Ruggles, who is here with us today, said that her mother was very insulted when she was offered to trade her Radcliffe PhD for a Harvard one, both because it implied that a Radcliffe degree was second class and because she had been denied a Harvard degree in the first place, even though all of her courses were at Harvard. And Nancy co-authored essentially all of her tenured husband's work while she was alive, but she never really received much credit for it. Together, the Ruggles are known for creating many of the rules for national income accounting, but again, Nancy never received a professorial appointment at Yale. Many years later, Jim Tobin would say that the situation with Nancy was a shame because she was someone who had all the necessary qualifications to be a professor, should have been, and would be under present circumstances. And I think that quote is incredibly powerful because we know that Jim Tobin is a Nobel laureate, and I think that speaks to just the blatant discrimination that women faced at that time. So after the Economic Growth Center, Nancy went on to go work for the United Nations as the assistant director of its statistical office. And there she really helped develop the rules for measuring economic activity in developing countries. So the next of the three women is Miriam Chamberlain. Miriam came to the EGC from the Ford Foundation, where she'd been a program officer in the higher education program. She also had a PhD in economics from Harvard, but she had been rejected from numerous economist positions, including one at an oil company, where she was told that women just could not be economists. So when she was forced out of the Economic Growth Center, she rejoined the Ford Foundation, where she became known as the fairy godmother of women's studies in the United States for all the grants she provided to universities, research centers, and publications. So as we know, the early 1970s were a time of tremendous change for women at universities. Yale saw its first fully co-ed undergraduate populations in those years, and the beginning of women students on campus really made the lack of female professors and research on women's issues more glaringly obvious. So Miriam at the Ford Foundation provided some of the first grants to women's studies and gave grants to establish research centers on women, to fund women's studies departments, and to publish research on women. Her support at the Ford Foundation gave a lot of legitimacy to this newly created field of women's studies. And later on, Yale's very own WGSS department received a grant from the Ford Foundation. So that was definitely part of Miriam's legacy. After leaving the Ford Foundation, she worked at the Russell Sage Foundation, where she founded the National Council for Research on Women, which was a consortium of nearly 100 groups that focus on women's issues. And finally, the third of the three women was Mary Reynolds. Mary had an early love of literature, but she studied political science because she thought that it was more practical. She originally attended Harvard for her PhD in political science, but she was shocked by the discrimination against female students, as her undergraduate education at Wisconsin had been co-ed, so she actually transferred to Columbia after a year. Afterwards, she really tried hard to look for faculty positions, but she was repeatedly told that women could not be professors. The last straw for her was when she finally received an academic appointment at Connecticut College, then a college for women, to build out its political science department, but the college decided to hire a younger man to be the department chair. So by the time Mary had started at the EGC, she really had faced numerous setbacks in her career as a political scientist, and she began to think differently about her love of literature during those years. And so she published her first literary criticism article on James Joyce and his mother while she was still at the EGC. And when she left the EGC, she completely devoted herself to literary research. So her seminal work, Joyce and Dante, studied Dante's influence over James Joyce's writing, and this book really cemented her place as a leading James Joyce scholar. Her other major contributions include supporting the first Chinese translation of Ulysses and doing the index for Richard Ellman's monumental biography of James Joyce. Mary was also finally able to teach again when she entered literature, and she taught an oversubscribed residential college seminar at Yale for many years on Irish literature. And she was truly a giant in the field, and she did all of that without ever having a true, professorial appointment in any academic department, which is really incredible. So all three women obviously were incredible leaders and scholars in their own right, and it was a real privilege to learn about them and to be able to share their stories with the department and the greater Yale community. And we're lucky enough today to be sitting with the daughters of two of these women, Anne Skinner, daughter of Mary Reynolds and Lloyd Reynolds, and Patricia Ruggles, daughter of Nancy Ruggles and Richard Ruggles. And both women are also Yale grads. Anne is a chemistry PhD from Yale, and Pat is a graduate from Yale, the Yale College class of 1974, which was the second co-ed class in Yale's history. In addition, we're super lucky to have Heidi Hartman and Marianne Bailey here with us today. Heidi was part of a group of young women who didn't accept the usual answers, and that was a group of Yale graduate students in economics who pushed for greater gender equality in economics on multiple levels, including spearheading the creation of the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession at the American Economics Association, and forcing the Yale Economics Department to stop meeting at Morey's, which at the time did not allow women inside. And you can actually see Heidi here front and center at the protest. And today, Heidi is best known as the founder of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, which has produced a lot of important work for understanding how policy affects women. And last but not least, we're here today with Marianne Bailey, who is the second female professor at the EGC and in the economics department as a whole. She was really instrumental in pushing for more women to be hired in the department and for female graduate students to be given a fair shot, which she'll tell us about a little bit later. And after Yale, she was involved in pioneering bioethics research as part of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Additionally, she taught at George Washington University, and she also did bioethics research for the Hastings Center. So now I'm excited to kick off the discussion with our wonderful panelists. And I have questions prepared for each of them, but we really encourage the audience to send in any questions over Q&A in the chat function on Zoom. And also I want to encourage our panelists to kind of just jump in at any time if they have something else they want to share, or if they have a question that they want to pose to the other panelists. So Anne, I wanted to start off with you. Anne's mother was Mary Reynolds, the EGC's first librarian and later a noted Irish literature scholar. And one of the things that you said that really stuck with me was your description of your mother as someone who truly did pivot and recalibrate and reinvent herself later in life with her second career. Can you tell me more about the first half of your mother's career and her experiences trying to find faculty positions in political science and the responses that she received?
Well, I can tell you one that when we were cleaning out the apartment after my parents died, there was a letter. She had applied for a position at Wesleyan, and they sent back a letter saying, Wesleyan does not hire women, period. So, you know, she was knocked down time and again. And I think it's possible that knowing she had this second interest really helped her. She wanted a professional position, and she was swimming against the current at the time. There's no question about it. As Cindy Taft said, she couldn't be a teaching assistant at Yale in the 50s because she was she was female. So I think that it is important to honor flexibility and to honor looking at options that you may not have originally considered. And I really think I've always felt my mother was an excellent role model. I did some reorganization myself eventually, and I appreciate the model that she gave me.
Yeah, and one thing that also I really found really like demonstrative of how much Mary Reynolds was committed to being a professor was that she would commute to the City College of New York system from Baltimore and then from New Haven to just teach a class, you know, a couple of times a week. And that is because, and I think that really shows how dedicated she was to teaching, because that's not an easy drive. And for her to do it, you know, many times a week says a lot. Pat, Your parents were once called by Jim Tobin the best husband-wife team in the history of economics. Can you tell us more about what their research partnership looked like?
Sure. They were actually really very strong as partners. My mother was very analytical and had very strong quantitative skills, and she was also a good writer, but she was also very shy and not terribly assertive. My father was somewhat disorganized and always had more ideas than he could possibly follow up on. And he wasn't necessarily very good at telling which of them were good ideas. So my mother was extremely helpful in helping him identify which were the ones that were, best followed up on. She really supplied, I think, the intellectual rigor in the team. And he was just a really optimistic, outgoing guy who was always willing to try pretty much anything. And that combination worked pretty well for them, I think.
Yeah, that it does. It definitely sounds like they were, kind of perfectly matched in terms of their strengths. Can you also tell us a little bit more about how technology forward they were? There's this story about them being the most amazing,
they were data people. And, they were data people in a period when there really weren't a lot of good options for analyzing large quantities of data. But both of them were very, very committed to the idea that you learned more by looking at data than you did by simply theorizing in a vacuum. And the work they were best known for was, of course, their work on national income accounting. They jointly did an enormous amount of work on defining concepts in GDP measurement and income measurement in general. And as you said, my mother's subsequent career after leaving Yale at the UN, she went to work as the director of the Office of Research at the Office of Statistics at the UN, where she really did basically kind of set the standards for what national statistical offices ought to be trying to measure in terms of economic status of the country, that kind of thing. Both of them worked hard to gather data and to analyze it. They actually invented a primitive computer of their own, which they had in our basement. And they, it became obsolete when the first census computers, the first IBM computers started to come out. But they were very into analysis. That when I was a child, they commuted to Washington, D.C. almost every weekend. We had a house in Washington so that they could work on the UNIVAC at Census, which was the only available large computer at the time. And I can still remember my mother in the machine room at Census, moving around the little wires on the UNIVAC in order to program it, because that was how you did it then. And there were three of us children, and they would just sort of set us loose on the lawn at Census while they went in and worked on the computer. And so they were very very active in trying to figure out how to use data better to understand what was going on in economies. And furthermore, they insisted that all three of us learn to program. And I took Fortran when I was like 12, and all of us got to work in the basement on the computer. So,
Pat, just a quick note. I spent about a month at one point working with your father, sorting cards for that primitive computer. I still remember it.
Yep.
Yes, and the Ruggles were described by former Yale professor as a two-person computerized data factory. So
it's true. Although they co-opted their children too. We were slaves in the data mine.
And their colleagues' children.
Thank you for sharing that. That's amazing. Heidi, you got to know Miriam when you two were assigned to room together at the National Women's Studies Association conference, and she became an inaugural board member of the organization you ultimately founded. Can you tell us more about the guidance and wisdom that Miriam provided you as you embarked on starting your own research organization?
Well, I think like many people, she was amazed that I was going to do it. There were there were a number of women's research centers at universities which Miriam had supported. And when I met Miriam, she was no longer a program officer at Ford, so she was never able to give any big grants to IWPR from Ford. But she was always very encouraging. I mean, that was one of the things about Miriam. And I think maybe, Pat, a little bit about your mother. I think she had the ability to recognize good ideas from bad ideas. And she thought that this was a winning idea to use economics to inform public policy questions about women. And one of the images I always have in my mind is of Senator Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy, and whenever he would, walk around anywhere, be on the Hill, wherever he was, you'd see people coming up to him and they would say, Senator Kennedy, I have an idea for blah, blah. And they'd give him a piece of paper and, he'd put it in his jacket pocket. And I just didn't feel that was happening on women's issues. I didn't feel that there was this policy force. And I knew there were all these, academic scholars that were capable of doing it, but we didn't have an avenue, a channel. There wasn't much happening on women at Brookings. There was for a short time at Urban Institute, but what would happen is someone interested in it would leave or would move on to another subject, and then that women's focus would be gone. So I wanted to start an institute that would maintain that women focus. And so she was very generous, and she was very selective in her advice. But I mean, just to give you an example of something simple, but it's something you need to learn, is that when new program officers come into foundations, that's when they have their most flexibility to give grants, because the grants that the former program officer had were generally at least partially tied off to enable the new program officer, to have some flexibility with the same pot of money. And, just one small example, she mentioned that a program officer was new at the Ford Foundation, Constance Buchanan, and she had a program on religious values. And we had a political scientist on staff who was very interested in again, that essence of the women's movement, what is driving it forward. And there was, the equal rights element of it, but there's also the communitarian element of it, like we're all in this together and how do we help each other? And so we met with Connie, and Amy Kayaza wrote a proposal, and we got a fairly sizable grant. It wasn't our first grant from Ford, but it was one of several. And Miriam was just so thrilled because she said, Heidi, I give advice to people all the time and mostly they don't take it. And here you followed up, and look, IWPR has gotten a big grant. I couldn't be happier. And this was just, the way she was. What I wanted to do, I was approached by other people about doing work on women in Eastern Europe, after the dissolution really of the Soviet Union. And I worked very hard on it. I met with a lot of people, and Miriam was always skeptical. She just said, I don't think that's going to go anywhere. And after about 2 years of efforts, I finally gave up. I couldn't make that happen. So she was very insightful, and but mostly I remember her encouragement and her generosity. Like one time when we had a deficit, which was pretty common in our early years, she said, "Oh, don't worry about it. Isn't that the definition of nonprofits? They're supposed to lose money." Eventually, we had to claw our way out of that deficit, but at the time, it was reassuring. So, and the other thing about Miriam is that she was always a happy person. She didn't feel badly about her career. I mean, yeah, she recognized she hadn't gotten an academic job in economics, but it was like, she made lemonade out of the lemons. She had this great career at Ford. Talking to Florence Howe, who we recently lost, the founder of Feminist Press and a terrific scholar in English. Florence and Miriam became best friends because Miriam loved data. And one of the things that Florence had been doing as a women's studies person was counting up how many women's studies courses there were at different colleges and how many students had enrolled in them. And Miriam presented that data to the board, at the Ford Foundation, to convince them that this was a growing field. And Florence said one of the stupidest things she ever did was that Miriam asked her, well, does anybody need any money in the field? And Florence said, no, why would they need money? They're doing their classes and everything. But she said Miriam invited her to travel. And in those days, international conferences and so forth, it was always top-notch hotels in Paris, the best restaurants. And I'm sure Ford's, cut back a little bit now. But in that way, Florence got educated about the process of the importance of granting to develop areas. And the feminist press went from, a little kind of shoebox thing with, people might remember their first products were mimeographed course syllabi on women. Feminist Studies 1, Feminist Studies 2, Feminist Studies 3, something like that. And then it grew to the feminist press and so on. So, she was generous and she was kind and she really educated a great many people about grant making and grant recipiency and proposal writing. And that was the role also of her National Council for Research on Women, which united all those centers. And a lot of what they did was self-help, teach each other communications, proposal writing, publications, and so on.
Yeah, Miriam was also very much a friend of my parents. And they had in common a strong interest in data, among other things. And I think my mother, to some extent, felt that, yeah, she'd been discriminated against, but so had Miriam. And, that was kind of the way life was. They talked about it a fair amount. And my mother was somewhat bitter, but I think she also, like Miriam, was very happy in what she ended up doing. And, felt eventually, I think that, well, one thing doesn't work out, you find something else, which is pretty much, I think, what Anne's story was as well, right?
Yeah, I think that's a commonality of all three women, that they were strong enough to, pick themselves up and find something satisfying. And they all did. They all went on to be very successful in some way or another.
Yeah, that is truly the common theme across all three women. It's just the ways that they were able to pivot and find other things when one door shut on them. And that's, I think, the most inspirational thing that I took away for sure. Marianne, you joined the EGC about 5 years after these women were forced out, and you have some pretty amazing stories about the difference that a woman's voice could make in a room when it came to hiring other female faculty. Can you tell us a little bit more about having the power of one woman in the room?
Well, first let me say a word or two about the fact that I was the year that I met and married a fellow student at MIT. And the two of us went on the job market together in the year that the nepotism rules crashed. Suddenly, all of a sudden, there were actually 5 couples that I remember, and we kept coming across each other as we were going around the country being interviewed. 5 couples who were economists, both economists and married, and we all got the same. Some of it, there was a bunch of jobs where they seemed to want people, and these were at the top. It was Harvard, there was Northwestern, various places. So anyway, so when I arrived at Yale, that was one of the things that it was the first time that they could hire both people. And I will say one thing for economics. They did take it seriously, because I was immediately put on the hiring committee, which they normally did not do. And it's a lot of trouble to be on the hiring committee. And the second year I was put on the graduate admission committee, partly because of what went wrong on the first year. And then after that and each year you usually were on the committees twice. and for 2 years. And the second time when I was on the graduate admissions committee, that also ended up being only a 1-year position. But at the same time, I will say that the economics department was serious about it, except they had a huge amount of implicit underlying bias in their heads about how you should actually act it out. And one other anecdote I want to tell before I start on that is, I talked to, at one point in struggling to get women taken seriously in the economics department, I talked to a Spanish professor, a woman in the Spanish department. And her tales were hair-raising. It was awful in the humanities. Economics, I think, took it seriously because they felt like they shouldn't really, if there were people who could do the job, they really should be hiring them, sort of like that. It's just that they were sort of dubious about whether they really could. But one of the things she told me was that, and by this time I was having problems with getting women admitted to the graduate school. And she said, well, she was on the admissions committee for the undergraduate school. And one of the things that she found was that their criteria, the men, was, we're looking for women who will make good wives for Yale men.
Uh-oh.
And this was something that really struck me, because I had been told for years that, oh yes, you bring in women, but then they're not stars. And at I was a graduate of Radcliffe, and the Radcliffe admission, I went to a Radcliffe admissions meeting, and they talked about how one of the women that was a star in the well, anyway, I'd been worried about this idea that somehow you are, my attitude was, if you couldn't do it, if you weren't stars, it was partly because of all these obstacles, which we have been talking about. But I never had thought about the fact that you could actually be admitted for the purpose of not being a star, because being married to a star is not very helpful. I mean, the husband of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is very unusual as a male. So anyway, but actually I think I know what Lisa's interest in is. There was one, for example, in the first year that I was on the hiring committee, there was a point where there was debate about, we had a very, very successful graduate from Harvard, and some people wanted her, some people didn't. She was very good. But one of the people said, well, you know, she's married and her husband isn't going to want to come to New Haven. So, you know, and I said, well, I don't really think you should do that. I mean, I've been really worried about that when I was being interviewed for jobs. And by the way, she actually told me as she left her seminar, when she had given their seminar, she had said, by the way, this is my first choice. I really, really want to come to Yale. So I said it, and he shut up. But if I hadn't been there, that's what would have happened. She would not have been hired because her husband wouldn't want to come to New Haven. And in the second year, when I was on the graduate admissions committee, we had the admissions to the graduate school were not very systematic. And there was a system where you just had 5 categories, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you were supposed to read the resume, I mean, the application that they sent in, and then just choose a number, okay? And I said, well, you know, what are the criteria? And so, well, you know, should they be here? Was basically when it came down to that. And so we all went away and we took piles of these applications and we filled them out. And when I came back, I put numbers on them. Okay, and my numbers were identical, not identical, but within one of the men. I was the only woman on the committee, by the way, of course. And so I was selecting exactly the same, mostly the same numbers for men, but for women, my numbers were systematically higher. Well, of course, I said, why is that? And of course, they all said, oh, well, because you're favoring the women. And I said, okay, but my position is you're favoring the men, or you're downplaying. So we talked it out, and I came up with some solutions. They were taking some parts of the process more seriously than I was. I mean, I thought if people had good math skills but not super duper, that was okay, but on the graduate record exams and so on. But anyway, the bottom line was, in the end,
I think we might have lost Marianne for a second. But at least one thing I found very interesting in my conversation with Marianne, which she was saying that when she and her husband at the time went on the job market, there was, sorry, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, we lost you for a second, but if you want to.
Yeah, occasionally my computer freezes. Otherwise, I have pretty good internet. But to make a long story short, after we had chosen all the people who were supposed to be admitted, and with some women in there, they went back and asked us to hire someone who had gotten into, was not even, someone I couldn't even fight for because she had a bad recommendation from her undergraduate school. And, but she was married to a person they wanted to keep at Yale. She was actually the wife of one of the junior faculty, one of the graduate students at Yale, and they wanted to hire him. And so we were told we had to go back and offer her admission. And the men actually did oppose this. They said, come on, you know, we didn't, she wasn't even ranked. And so, but they actually did. We gave up. We had to give up. They went ahead and we had to offer every person above her on our rank admission. And then, but without scholarships. And so and of course all the people above her refused admission because they couldn't afford to come. And so then she was admitted without a scholarship. So all we managed to do was stop her from getting a fellowship. So that was my second story, and I was off that committee. And then the final story I think you're looking for is the one about how I was not on any committees now. And I was just on the faculty, and I went to the faculty after, and there was the faculty meeting where you take the recommendations from the admissions, the people who have worked on the junior faculty admissions, hiring decisions, and you make the decision. And so there were two people, and one happened to be a man and one happened to be a woman. And the woman was for the Growth Center, and the Growth Center actually needed a woman very bad. I mean, needed this particular woman very badly because she was in development, whereas the other one was in theory. He was a theorist. And the faculty voted, and it came out exactly even. Same number of faculty for the man and the same number for the woman. And I was not a very assertive person. I could be assertive in small groups and committees, but in the whole faculty, there I am, and I'm sitting there and I don't want to say anything. Oh, please leave me. God, no, don't make me do this, God. But I thought I had to do it. And I said, well, isn't this the sort of situation in which affirmative action is relevant? You know, the faculty is evenly divided, and the Growth Center really does need a development economist. And I was in the Growth Center, and it was like, oh dear, someone has dropped a bomb, a grenade. And, well, not really a grenade, more like something that smells. That would be more accurate. And Richard Nelson said, to his great credit, and he was a very nice man, he said, you know, that's right. We should do this. Of course, that's exactly what affirmative action is. We're evenly divided, we should hire the woman. So they did. But I mean, you think, oh, I'm telling you, and one last thing I'll say is that by the second, but the point is the economics department I don't think was nearly as bad as the rest of academia. And I do really want to say that because I know I've been sort of shocked at some of the things I've been reading lately about how they're treating women. And I really would have thought they wouldn't be that bad by this time. But anyway, the last thing I want to say is that by the second semester of my first year at Yale, I was really wiped out because I felt like I had been so aware of being a woman, constantly thinking that here I am, a woman, where there isn't supposed to be a woman, and here I am, and I'm trying to do what I'm supposed to do, and I had just barely finished my thesis by January of the first year of my first year at Yale. And I said, I've got to get some women friends. So I went to the Yale Women's Center and joined a consciousness raising group. And it was a lifesaver. I'm still in touch with those people. And in the pandemic, 3 of them I'm still in touch with. There were others in the group, but and we have started meeting again. And so it's so funny to think of that. One of them was a geneticist at Yale. But anyway, I digress. Let me now stop and just say those are some stories.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is Rohini said that, you know, some things don't seem to have changed very much these days.
They have changed, I think. I think they were worse, way worse back then.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, I think they didn't change very rapidly. When I, as you mentioned, I was in the second class of women at Yale, and I can remember meeting with Kingman Brewster with a small group of undergraduate women, trying to make the case that they should actually admit women on the same basis as men. You know, at the time we were limited to a very, very small fraction of the class, and Kingman Brewster had made a commitment that Yale would continue to graduate 1,000 male leaders a year. And, you know, he made it really clear that our purpose was to keep them from losing the men they wanted to get, that they were not actually interested in educating women. We were simply there as a, you know, well, we can't get the right guys unless there are a few women here.
Yeah, that actually I think has been true generally. I wanted to pick up on the implicit bias because when I was a graduate student, I didn't have a problem with my fellow students actually, and there was no institutional problem because, as was said, Yale had been admitting women for graduate study for decades. But I have 2 stories. One is being unmarried and being told, well, why should I take you in my group? This is chemistry where you're looking for a mentor. Why should I take you in my group? You'll just get married and quit. And the other, which was, I was the only woman in my class and there was one woman in the class ahead of me. And she was asked, she was married, and she was asked, well, what form of birth control are you using? And the problem is it's no longer legal to ask those questions. But I think that we have to, women of the current generation should be well advised to consider that there are still people who are thinking that, even if they can't ask it. I mean, I didn't have any real problems. These were individual incidents, and I had a perfectly good mentor. And as I said, my fellow students were fine with it, but it did jar you. It did really jar you at the time.
We're also lucky enough to have Marcia Goldfarb here with us today. And Marcia was the first female faculty member in the department and at the Growth Center. And Marcia, we just kind of picking up on this, you know, experience of being isolated and being the only woman. I wanted to ask you that you first described being the first female faculty at the EGC as a mixed bag of insecurity, stress, and delight. And could you tell us a little bit more about what that experience was like?
Well, I actually found myself very surprised to end up at Yale. I had been a graduate student at Northwestern, and actually Mary Ann and I overlapped, I think, by 1 year. My last year of graduate school, I think, was Mary Ann's first year as a graduate student before she transferred to MIT. But when I got the job offer from Yale, it came as a big surprise to me. And I was very concerned about how I was going to be able to compete on even terms with all these very famous, world famous economists that were suddenly going to become my colleagues. So there was a certain amount of fear and insecurity about arriving at Yale. And when I got to Yale, I discovered that there was only one other woman who was on the faculty, but she was not on a tenure track, and that was Susie Lepper at the Coles Foundation, who was very, very nice. But it was kind of lonely at the Growth Center, being the only female. I function best, I think, when I function as part of a team with different people with different sort of abilities all working together. But I found it rather difficult to develop these kinds of ties when I was at the Growth Center, being the only female. There were 3 other women in professional positions at the Growth Center at the time that I was there. There was Susan Eggers, who was an administrative assistant. There was a woman whose name I recalled about an hour ago, but a senior moment has taken hold. I can't think of it, but she was sort of the more senior administrative assistant. And there was the head librarian of the Growth Center at that time, Billy Salter. And Billy Salter and I became very, very good friends. And it's a friendship that lasted many, many decades. A thing that helped assuage what I generally felt as loneliness at the Growth Center was the fact that I met another assistant professor in the Department of Economics who was hired the same year I was, and that was Bob Goldfarb, who's sitting out of sight basically here. And he and I have been married now for over 50 years. But Bob had been a graduate student at Yale and had been hired at Yale and had a wide circle of friends. And so there were friendships with other faculty, but they tended not to be at the Growth Center. They tended to be more at Strathcona and generally among the more junior faculty. At the time that, I think that I was very, very lucky because I came onto the job market at a time when the demand for economists in general was growing very, very quickly. And there were signs of increasing acceptance of women into the profession. So at that time, nobody expected to get tenure at Yale unless you were almost guaranteed Nobel Prize material, like, for example, Joe Stiglitz. And so you came to Yale with the intention that you would be there perhaps for 5 years, and then you would go someplace else. But in the meantime, you had had 5 years to really develop a research portfolio and interests. And as it turned out, in my case, both Bob and I were among the people who did not get tenure at Yale. And it's kind of an interesting story. When we went into the job market in 1972, attitudes towards women in economics, I think, had mellowed quite a bit. And the concept of women in economics had become more comfortable for a lot of people. But in any case, I had hopes of ending up in the Northeast, primarily because I had an aging mother who was alone in a town in Pennsylvania, and I wanted to be within commuting distance of her. And I had also spent 6 summers working in various government positions in Washington in internships. And I had enjoyed my summer experiences in Washington. And so I thought that when Bob and I left New Haven, that if we ended up somewhere in the Northeast, I would be able to find a job. And at that point in my life, I would have been perfectly happy with a government position or with an academic position. The funny story is that Bob was offered a job at a new campus in the University of Maryland system called the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Okay, the only university in the United States with county as part of its name. They made Bob a job offer, but Bob, several weeks later, received a job offer from the George Washington University in DC, which was a much larger, more established Department of Economics with the graduate program. And so he accepted the offer at GW. This left UMBC high and dry. So they simply deleted $1,000 from the offer that they had made to Bob and made the offer to me. And so I ended up at UMBC, not terribly concerned at that time about the fact that I was receiving $1,000 a year on a base, I think, of about $14,000, less than Bob was. But I hadn't really made a whole lot of effort to get that job in the first place. So in any case, I went there and I actually had 37 very happy years at UMBC. But the main point is that I think I was very, very lucky in getting the offer from Yale at a time when attitudes towards women in economics were beginning to soften.
Right, and it's very interesting because the time when Marcia and Marianne kind of joined the department was also the time when Heidi was a graduate student. And Heidi, at this time when Yale was going co-ed and more women were coming into the faculty, you and your peers really spearheaded some pretty amazing initiatives for gender equality in economics. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you guys organize and strategize to really push for some pretty lasting change? I think you're currently muted.
Yeah, there we go. Well, I want to credit Laura Nisanoff, who was listening today. She was a born organizer, and she organized all of us at Yale, all the women at Yale, I think. One of the things that somehow we did, and I don't remember exactly which year it was, but we decided to have a conference on women in economics, and we used the Yale Law School because it had a big auditorium. And we had hundreds of people, 300 or 400 people came from up and down the East Coast to hear about the economics of women and to participate in workshops and everything. That was one of the things. I don't know if Lori was involved in the photo you had of the demonstration outside Morey's. That was mainly New Haven Women's Liberation. But one of the funnier things was that I saw Professor Tobin trying to approach Morey's, but he was a very careful guy, and so he was pacing back and forth behind the library, which was right across the street from Morey's. And I could see him there, and I'm sure he didn't know that I was in the gauntlet that he had to go through. And we were asking every white male who came into the club, not that men of color couldn't join, they could have, but we didn't see any that day. We asked them, tell me, sir, are you a racist as well as a sexist, or only a sexist? And so when James Tobin came by, that was the question I asked him. And to his credit, about 2 or 3 months later, I got a letter from him explaining why he was neither a racist nor a sexist. And I guess I must have had James Tobin, for macro, and we were always on good terms. But that was just one of it encapsulates kind of like what was going on in New Haven. There were demonstrations all the time. There was a Black Panther trial, Bobby Seale, there was anti-war, there were demonstrations, there were gatherings in the green. Yale escaped student strikes because Brewster and Coffin were so liberal. They were like, oh yes, come, stay in our courtyards, we'll give you yogurt and granola. And we didn't have, the violence and the sit-in type of thing. But it was a very, very heady political time. So in that context, I started the graduate program in the fall of '69, and Lori was in the class that joined in the fall of '70. Well, in '68, the Union for Radical Political Economics had gotten started at University of Michigan and also Harvard and MIT. In fact, I think Lori had been involved in it at MIT. And mostly as an anti-war group, it started out trying to prove that the economics of the war were very, very bad. And in the class of '70, virtually every single graduate student joined IRPI, including Rick, who was the latest president of Yale?
Rick Levin.
Rick Levin, yes. Rick Levin had hair to his shoulders, and he joined IRPI. And everyone did. And so that, we had the Graduate Student Alliance in economics. We invited all the speakers. We would have Marxists like Sweezy or Sam Bowles, Herb Gintis. We had control because there were so many. And in that context, the CSWEP project was a part of the IRPI Women's Caucus. Fran Blau, who was at Yale because her husband was teaching and she was still finishing up her PhD at Harvard, was part of IRPI. Patty Quick was, who I think was at Harvard, graduate student, was part of IRPI. And these are the people who went to the CSWEP, went to the AEA meetings in 71 to make a resolution and get it on the floor to pass the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession. So how we organized, I mean, we didn't have email. We must have had phones and letters. And I didn't go to those meetings because I was pregnant at the time, and I was just at the point where I was showing. And I was a teaching assistant, with a class. And I honestly was fearful that if the faculty knew I was pregnant, they would take away my second semester job. So I didn't want to go to the meetings because then they would know in late December that I was pregnant, whereas semester wouldn't start until like maybe January 15th, January 20th, whatever. And it would be very obvious by then. So, but one of the things I found, just ironically, is that once I got pregnant and had a child, it was almost like the male faculty could relate to me better because now I was an ordinary woman who did what their wives did. And so that was just a little interesting thing to me. But you have to just understand it was a very political time. And, when people organized, we just thought we would get what we asked for.
Yeah, we were very naive in those days. I wanted to say Heidi had an enormous influence on me. I was an undergraduate when Heidi was a graduate student, and I took her seminar on women in the labor force. And it was the collection of women graduate students at Yale who convinced me that you could really be a woman and be an economist. And I don't think I would have gone to graduate school in economics without that experience. So it was very important to me.
Well, thank you. It was interesting that there were so many women graduate students, and we didn't even realize. Lori Nisanoff told me that her mentor at MIT, Matt Adel, searched around for graduate schools where she would be comfortable, and he recommended Yale because there were the most women. Now, in the class of '69, 4 women started. It was a little bit of a larger class. I don't know how many started in the class of '70, but probably at least 4. And the Morey's demonstration was part of trying to get the official groups at Yale who met at Morey's on the second floor where there was a meeting room to stop doing that, because Morey's would not admit women, undergraduate women, even after they came into the school. They didn't send honorary invitations to graduate student women the way they did men, or faculty women the way they did men. Sue Lefferts worked at Kohl's. She went to the department meetings. She had to walk up the outside stairs to the second floor meeting room because she wasn't allowed to go through the downstairs club. And we thought this was outrageous. And we got every single female graduate student to sign our letter saying that the Yale Economics Department could not meet at Morey's. And they actually did stop meeting at Morey's. And I think the woman who wrote this book recently on women undergraduates at Yale told me that only the law school and the economics department stopped meeting at Morey's during that time until Morey's.
Yeah, I went to graduate school in economics at
finally integrated because anyway, I would just conclude and say, oh, I'm the one that's off, right? You can't hear me. Go on.
I think we can hear you now, Heidi.
Oh, okay. I would just say that, yes, it was a funny thing that you wouldn't realize that, 11 or 12, 15, however many women signed that letter across all 4, 5, 6 years of being in graduate school was a lot in economics, but it was. And I didn't feel, I'm sure it was worse for Marcia. I didn't feel lonely because, I had a peer group, not only of women, but of IRPI people who hung out together and had study groups together. And that communal feeling, Marianne, that you expressed about having a consciousness raising group through the Women's Center, which I also worked in to develop, is something that, helps get you through in these situations.
Yeah. Yeah, in contrast, I went to graduate school at Harvard, and it was a lot different. I was the only woman in my class. When I applied, Zvi Grilikus, who was on the Harvard admissions committee, told me that I needed to get an NSF fellowship because they had a policy of not giving money to women. And yeah, he was really open about it.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, and when I got there, I discovered, yeah, they had one woman per year, and she always had an NSF fellowship. You know, it was, and it was a pretty grim experience. So yeah, Yale was ahead in that sense, that you were not as completely isolated as I was at Harvard.
It's kind of crazy. The time has flown by. We're kind of near the end of this session, but I think there's maybe one last thing that I would love to ask all of our panelists to just share a sentence or two about, and that's, you know, we've talked about the lack of women in academia and especially in economics for a very long time. So I wanted to ask, why has progress been so slow, and what more do we need to be doing? And if you guys each just want to take a minute to answer that, that would be a great way to end.
Well, I have a thought about that. I would say that one of the reasons progress is slow in economics is that it's a very hierarchical field intellectually. There's the mainstream neoclassical economic approach, and that dominates through the AEA, through the NBER, and it crowds out other ideas. And very often people who are diverse, you know, also have diverse ideas. And it is harder for them to get a foothold in a field which is so hierarchical. And also, the Economics Association is organized very oddly compared to other professional associations. In another professional association, sociology or psychology, you can say, hey, I'm interested in gender. Hey, I'm interested in pets. Hey, I'm interested in world systems, and start a unit. And that's part of the association. And what happens at the AEA is anybody who has a different idea has to start their own nonprofit. And so there's all these different associations, and by being prominent in one of those, that doesn't give you any mileage in the AEA. Whereas in these other associations, you can be, you know, head of one of the marginal groups, and it grows and becomes important. And then you can be important in the American Sociological Association because you're part of them. You're not considered somebody who is, you know, trash and had to go to a different organization, and you're clamoring to get 1 or 2 meeting rooms to have a session at the annual meetings, because the AEA controls who gets how many rooms. So it's a poorly organized association if what you want to do is let many flowers bloom.
I would say that something that's been very encouraging to me is the growth of interest in empirical economics, as you know, as more data has become available and as we have a better capacity to analyze it. For most of my career, the sort of mainstream economics profession was very dominated by theorists. And it was very, very difficult for a woman to be accepted as a theorist. It was, you know, it's a more subjective thing in many ways than empirical work. And if you weren't part of the in crowd, you just weren't. And if you were a woman, you couldn't be. So, you know, and I can remember, I had the typical problem of not getting great academic job offers. I mean, I got interviewed everywhere because they all wanted to say they had interviewed a woman, but I didn't get a lot of offers. And I ended up going to work for the government. And when I told my advisor that that was what I was going to do, he said, "You don't need a PhD for that." And I think that as it's become easier to do empirical work, and it's become more acceptable to do empirical work, women who are interested in topics in labor and things like that, which have always attracted more women, have become more mainstream in some sense, or more acceptable to the profession. So I see those as sort of trends that are converging that I think are helpful.
I think that's right. And I would just add that through continued organization, the AEA is now, you know, actually putting some resources into increasing diversity and challenging a very, you know, aggressive culture that we also have in economics, where, you know, you prove yourself by cutting everybody else off at the knees. Sure. Lori told me that the conference we did was November 1971. So within just a little more of a year of Lori arriving at Yale, we had a conference of 400 people. That's an organizer.
Yeah, so clearly this may well be a reason why we're going to need to have another of these sessions. So yeah, maybe we should have a last couple of comments if anyone had to. Otherwise, I think we probably move towards wrapping up, but Mary and Marsha, did you have any thoughts on what it would take to increase presence of women in the profession, but also at Yale? I mean, I think one thing I'm struck by is the numbers you're talking about aren't that different right now. I think 4 in a class of 20 or 25 is very much the norm in economics, very much the norm in Yale. And I think, unfortunately, we may even have lost ground in terms of being one of the better departments in terms of the number of women coming to it. So, yeah. I'd love to hear if you have any other thoughts, Marianne or Marsha, from your ears.
And also for chemistry. Be very
yes, and
I would just say that if you want the experience of being the only woman in the room, science is a good field to go into. It didn't bother me to be the only woman in my graduate class because I've been the only woman in my undergraduate classes, not infrequently. So that's good training, good training. Mind you, things have changed. I'm at Williams, and about 50% of our chemistry department is female, and 50% of our majors are female. The science as a well, most of the people in my graduate school class had come from institutions like Williams, and it is undergraduate institutions like that that I think have been more friendly to women and therefore make a better pipeline for sending women to graduate schools than perhaps Harvard or Yale does.
Although, you know, it's striking that you've got half women in your graduate programs now, and I don't know of any economics department or major economics department where that's true.
Undergraduate. Williams is only undergraduate.
Even undergraduate. I mean, you know, there are a lot fewer in economics than there are even in a field like chemistry at this point.
Well, there were very few women well, of course, women weren't admitted as undergraduates. I forgot. I was going to say there weren't any women chemistry majors, but there weren't any. Oh, well, time flies.
But economics is doing worse than math and physics and chemistry. Yes, it is.
And I
was going to say the slope is worse. Like
it's worse than engineering.
Oh wow, that's really bad.
So maybe actually it'd be interesting, Lisa, to have your perspective as a just graduate, undergraduate with economics major. I'm very happy to give you the last word on this question of, how did you find economics as a profession or as a major, I guess?
I mean, what everyone has just said is pretty accurate. I think there's only about 30% of the economics majors are women. And so frequently you're one of the few people in the class, or your male peers kind of want to mansplain over you and act like everything's so easy. But then of course the exam comes and you do better than them. So that has been my experience. But I guess if Marianne or Marsha just wants to say one last thing, then we might be able to wrap this up. And this has been a great conversation. So thank you to everyone.
Let me just say that I deacculturated when I went into health economics and ended up being interdisciplinary, which is a very different experience. And from being an economist, I mean, you have to really respect philosophers and people like that. And I liked it. I was very excited by it. But I do think that I bet it's got to do a lot with the introductory courses. I think that I remember Ec 1. I never even thought of becoming an economist. I was a math major at Harvard when I was at Radcliffe. And what made me go into economics was I realized I was never going to make it as a mathematician. So I went into African history. And my plan was to go to African history, and then I would go to graduate school in African history, but first I'd go in the Peace Corps, and I would have this 2 years in Africa. And while I was in Africa, I realized I got fascinated by what was going on. The government was overthrown, and whenever you asked people why, they would say, well, the price of sardines doubled. I can't buy a cloth for I used to be able to buy two cloths for my wife, and now I can only buy one a year. And so I thought, what is this thing called economics? And so I took a course at the University of Ghana, which was actually quite left-wing, and came back to the United States, went to graduate school, started out in African history, but I took an economics course as a graduate student, and I changed over into economics the second year at Northwestern. That's and then I applied to graduate school because I wanted to go back to the East Coast. Plus the other reason I did it, by the way, Marcia, is that I thought that I looked at where Northwestern graduate students in economics went. And at that time, they all the men went to places like Rochester and good schools. And some of them even went to the top-notch ones. And I thought, well, I'm a woman, I will go one notch down. And that means Grinnell College, Iowa. And so I think I want to get into, so I applied to Harvard, Yale, and MIT and got into graduate school on all three. And I think it was because of the story I wrote, which was that I wasn't an undergraduate economics department person, and I had gotten into this, and also I did manage to graduate in math from Harvard. So that did it. But I'm just saying, I would never, and my classmates, my roommates at Harvard hated Ec 1. Both of them had to take it, and they hated it. And every woman I knew hated it, and a lot of men did too, because it just wasn't, it didn't seem to really, it wasn't interesting and about the real world. And I think that is, I'm sure that's still true. About the introductory economics classes. And so I think that's probably got a lot to do with it. That's all.
Lisa, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Marcia, yeah, do you want to go ahead and then we can wrap this up?
A couple of things. I agree completely that the entry of women into economics was helped very much by its moving in a much more empirical direction than it had been. Patricia's point. A second point is, I'm a little surprised to hear that the percentage of women in graduate programs in economics has been shrinking, but that may be partially explained by the growth of schools of public policy.
Yes, I think that's a factor.
Yeah, it's very much so. And depending on the particular school, economics is often a joint department within a school of public policy, or has very close brotherly or sisterly relationships with the School of Public Policy. But the dividing line between schools of public policy and Department of Economics in some sense has become very, very narrow. And it's possibly economics has begun to be seen as too mathematical and theoretical, and people interested in real world types of problems are much more oriented towards going into schools of public policy than they used to be. I also want to mention that I came to Yale in 1968. I never heard the story about the three women who just a few years before me had been hired in the department and had been basically fired because of the nepotism thing. When Lisa initially contacted me about this, and I started to sort of read the stories about Nancy Ruggles and Mary Reynolds and Miriam Chamberlain, I was just astounded and appalled that had happened. Kind of a third point is that in terms of dealing with women, by the mid-1970s, I found myself in a position where there was very little animosity in the places where I was towards hiring women into economics positions. At that point, I was simultaneously working two jobs. I was an advanced assistant professor and then an associate professor at UMBC. And basically 50% of the people we hired, we went on a growth spurt for the next 10 years, were females. Now, a lot of it was out of convenience because these were married women whose husbands were at the College Park campus or were working for the federal government nearby. So there were a lot of very highly qualified women available, and there was no difficulty in hiring them. And the same thing happened with the federal agency I was working for part-time, which is now known as the Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research, where again, at least 50% of the economists that we hired were women. So I entered in at perhaps the exact best moment to be in economics, because there did seem to be this shift towards encouraging women, or at least allowing more women into the profession. Thank you, by the way, Lisa and all of you for setting this up. It's been informative very, very interesting and fun.
Yeah, and thank you all for being here today. I've learned a lot from talking with all of you. And you definitely have, I think, helped with this feminist revision of Yale economics history. So now I just want to turn it back to Rohini for some last remarks, and then we can conclude this.
Well, I think I don't really have much to add except that this was fascinating. Thank you. And, we're just starting the celebrations or whatever for the 60th anniversary of Economic Growth Center, which is next fall. And I should say that one reason actually we started on this journey was when I started at EGC and I started to learn about it, I clicked on a website for the 50th anniversary of EGC, and it looked like a very male anniversary page. And I was curious to say that, were there really no women involved? And it's just been fascinating to learn about, in some sense, the shoulders of the giants that we all stand on. So thank you very much. I very much hope that we'll be able to engage you with activities during the year. So thanks everyone. Thank you for all the participants for joining us.
Thank you.